Welcome to Trey's Theory Corner!
What's up, Gear Mortals? Trey Xavier here. Get ready to get geeky on Trey's Theory Corner as we discuss intervals. As I briefly mentioned in the last episode, an interval is just the distance between any two notes. So this is, of course, the simplest relationship that we have to worry about in music because it's just two notes. Things get a lot more complicated from here out. So we have to make sure that we have this really down before we go any further. So you might be thinking that there's 144 combinations of pairs of those 12 different notes, but we're not worried about the absolute relationships between any two given notes. Intervals are names for the distance between those notes, so no matter what the actual note names and their relationships are, it's just that distance. For example, the distance between G and A is a major second, and the distance between C and D is also a major second. We don't have distinct names for them just because of where they sit. No matter where you put it, the distance is always absolute. So that means that just as there are only 12 notes, there are only 12 intervals. Now, some of you theory heads are going, wait a second, Trey, but there's a bunch of different ones that have different names. And so those are enharmonic equivalents, which means it's the same actual distance with a different name. For example, this interval is called a tritone, but it's also called a diminished fifth or an augmented fourth. And the actual effective difference is 0. It's still the same two notes of D and G sharp, but in different situations, you call them different things. We're not going to worry about that just now. I just want to make sure you understand the concept. So within one octave, there's only 12 different possible distances between any two different notes. So one important distinction that we have to make is the difference between a melodic and a harmonic interval. A melodic interval is just when you play the notes one at a time, and a harmonic interval is when they happen at the same time. Pretty simple. So now I'm going to go through and play each of those 12 intervals for you so that you can hear them, and I'm going to display the names on the screen so that you know what they're called. I'm going to play them as both melodic and harmonic intervals in the key of C, and I'm also going to play them on the keyboard so that you can see what they look like there. Okay, here we go. Ready, keyboard hands? So that gives you an idea of what they look like, what they sound like, and what they're called. So that's going to be the basis for so much of what we do here on the Theory Corner and what you're going to do in music in general. Of course, combinations of several different intervals stacked or arranged in certain ways are essentially what lays the foundation for harmony as we know it. One of the important ways in which we categorize different intervals is by sonance, which means are they dissonant or are they consonant? So what defines them as dissonant and consonant is a little bit vague, to be honest. Part of it is actually defined by their mutual exclusivity and sort of the general consensus on how they sound, which means that a dissonant interval is called a dissonant interval because it's not consonant, and a consonant interval is consonant because it's not dissonant, which is a little confusing and weird. I'm going to give you a sort of bare bones basic guide as to which are generally considered dissonant and generally considered to be consonant. And you'll kind of hear why they're distinguished that way when I start to play them. In fact, when you heard me play all the intervals before, you could probably hear which ones sounded a little tenser and more crunchy and kind of not as pleasant maybe to the ear, and the ones that sound sort of complete at rest or whole, depending on how you want to think of it. Really, we're just using words to describe sounds, which is, as they say, like dancing about architecture. So the definition of those words is going to be in part up to you. But when you're discussing this with other people, it's really handy to have a set of guidelines and a general consensus on how they're considered to be. One thing that people generally agree upon when talking about dissonance is that it feels unresolved. It feels like it wants to resolve to a consonant interval. And when you reach a consonant interval, it's generally considered to some degree at rest. Now, this definition varies wildly by things like genre, culture, musical stylings, and more than anything by context. So you always have to take this kind of stuff with a little bit of a grain of salt and go from there. One definition I saw that I really liked is that the difference is based on a shared understanding. Now, that's a very powerful idea that I'm not going to go into too much, but it basically just means that that's what everybody kind of feels like it is. All right, so now I'm going to play for you all the different intervals that are considered consonant, and then I'm going to play all the ones that are considered dissonant so that you can hear the difference, hopefully. Okay? Ready, keyboard hands? Okay, here's all the dissonant ones. Keep in mind that consonant and dissonant don't mean good and bad, or that dissonance should always be avoided in favor of consonants. That would make your music extraordinarily boring to listen to, okay? Dissonance builds a little bit of tension in the music, and consonance tends to release it. And that's such a massive concept in music that you literally can't have one without the other. It's like trying to have Luke Skywalker with no Darth Vader. It cannot exist. There's no point. It's no fun to watch, you know, to just have Luke Skywalker be the good guy and win all the time over nobody.
Make for a very boring trilogy, that would, yes?
Different situations call for different types of consonants and dissonance in varying combinations, and that's going to be something that we come back to a lot. What's a little bit weird about the consonant versus dissonant thing is that the definitions have changed over time. Thirds were once considered to be a dissonance, and that's why medieval music is full of fourths and fifths. That has to do a little bit with the type of tuning system that they used and the temperament of the instruments that they were playing. So the definitions and the way that we think about them has definitely changed over time. I imagine that it'll continue to change over time as our understanding of sound, pitch, vibration, and frequency and all of that also changes. One very important factor that we have to take into account when looking at intervals is that they can all be inverted. So all that means is that you take the top note of the interval and move it down an octave so that it's underneath. And now we have a different interval than what we started with. I'll give you a quick example. Here's the interval of a fifth from C to G, okay? If we take this G and move it down an octave, and we still have a G and a C, but now we have the interval of a fourth from the G to the C. Intervals are always counted from the lower note to the higher note. And that's also very important to remember. So when we invert a fifth, we get a fourth. Inverting intervals gets to be a little bit of a tricky business in terms of how we define them and what their names are. But there's only two larger categories of intervals, and those are the perfect intervals and the major-minor intervals. The major or minor intervals can only be major or minor, but ones that are considered perfect can either be perfect, augmented, or diminished. When we augment an interval, we make it larger. We diminish an interval, we make it smaller. Perfect intervals are defined as intervals that can be inverted and remain perfect. So that's another one of those mutual exclusivity definitions. Basically, a perfect interval is anything that isn't any of the other ones. Now, a major or a minor interval will invert to the opposite. So if you have a major interval and you invert it, it will become a minor interval. So for instance, a major sixth will invert to a minor third. So if we take that top note and move it down an octave, we get a different interval, of course, a sixth versus a third, but the major or minor quality of it is now inverted. A perfect fifth becomes a perfect fourth, whereas a major third, if we invert it, becomes a minor sixth. I know that's a little weird and hard to understand at first, but as we go on, it's going to become a little more clear why that matters. Now I'm going to go through each of the intervals and invert them so that you can see what happens when you do that and hear what it sounds like. I'm going to leave out the augmented and diminished intervals for now, and you'll understand why later. Here we go. So, of course, a unison is just two instances of the same note in the same octave. So, of course, when you invert that, it's just two C's. When you invert that, nothing happens. No change. Minor second becomes a major seventh. A major second becomes a minor seventh. A minor third becomes a major sixth. Major third becomes a minor sixth. Perfect fourth becomes a perfect fifth. Right? Like we said, perfect inverts to perfect. Perfect fifth becomes a perfect fourth. Then we come to the exact middle of the octave, and here's where it gets really interesting. So we're going to talk about this interval called a tritone, which is also known as a diminished fifth or a augmented fourth. What that means is that when you invert a tritone, you get a tritone. So personally, that to me seems like it should be called a perfect tritone because it inverts to still an interval that is the same kind. But it's not considered that as far as higher order music theory is concerned. And that could be because when it inverts, it doesn't really invert exactly because it's still a tritone. You can do that forever, all the way up and up. So it's kind of in a category of its own. Moving onward. Perfect fifth inverts to a perfect fourth. Like we said, perfect inverts to perfect. You may notice that we're actually kind of starting to turn back around in on ourselves because we've kind of already explored these relationships just going the opposite direction. So you might actually start to be able to predict what I'm going to say. A minor sixth inverts to a major third. A major sixth inverts to a minor third. A minor sixth inverts to a major second. A major seventh inverts to a minor second. And then we get to an octave, which is the same two notes, C and C in this case, just separated by an octave. When you invert an octave, you just get an octave. So kind of like the unison, there's no change except we've just moved the notes to a different octave. One really good way to get a good grasp on this stuff is to play them on your instrument. I would go through and play each of those 12 intervals in every key and every position so that you really get a grasp for how to play them and what they sound like. It's going to really open up the whole world of your instrument, the fretboard or the keyboard or the saxophone board, I don't really know. But being able to go from any one note to any other note at any given moment and know what it's going to sound like is going to free you up musically a lot. So try that out. So we've actually covered now all 12 of the intervals that exist. The enharmonic equivalents, which just means the different names for those intervals, we haven't gone over just yet. But I'm going to do a video for every single interval that we just went over individually. And when I do that, I'll talk about the different names for them. And then you'll get a better grasp of why they're called different things in different situations. So hopefully by watching this today, you've got a better grasp on what intervals are, what they sound like, and what they're called most of the time. If there's anything that you feel that I missed, or any questions that you have for something maybe I didn't explain it that clearly, please leave your questions below in the comments section, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Thanks so much for watching, and please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so that you can get notifications about my upcoming lessons delivered right to your inbox. And, for more reviews as well and original content that we do here at Cure Gods. So have a great couple of weeks until the next episode goes up 2 Tuesdays from now, and I will see you then. First thing you got to think about when it comes to music theory. Number 1, what the fuck is it? What the fuck is music theory? If you already know the answer, please don't shout it out, because you'll look like a crazy person at home by yourself. But really, in order for you to understand what you even need it for or why you should care, you got to know what it is. And before we go any further, I have to define what I think of music theory as for you, so that we can take this journey together to improve our musical knowledge and understanding.